Stop it, Dust Bunny. Ow. Stop it, I said. Good morning. Here we are. Getting ready, if the Lord wills, to look at Parker, talking to the two seeds. And I want to stop that cap. I want to go back. I meant to watch last week's video, but I didn't. Why would I want to watch last week's? I can't remember where I left off. Can't remember whether we did the 8 considerations. I know we did the 10 questions. I don't think we did the 8 considerations. And that's where we're going to start, with the considerations that he brings up there. We used to sing hymn 201 on the Eastern Shore to a different tune than when I first learned it. Yeah, it's the Lloyd book. Morning. "201 in the Lloyd book. One of my favorites. Children of the heavenly King, as you journey sweetly sing. Sing your Savior's worthy praise, glorious in his works and ways. We are traveling home to God in the way the fathers trod. They are happy now, and we soon their happiness shall see. O ye banished seed, be glad. Christ our advocate is made, us to save our flesh assumes, brother to our souls becomes. Shout ye little flock, and blessed, you on Jesus' throne shall rest. There your seat is now prepared, there your kingdom and reward. Fear not, brethren, joyful stand on the borders of your land. Christ your Father's only Son let you undismayed go. Lord, submissive, make us go, gladly leaving all below. Only thou, our leader, be, and we still will follow thee. That's 201 in the Lloyd book. I guess it's in all the Primitive Baptist hymn books. I've seen one, I don't think, that didn't have it. Has different tunes. That's the old tune I remember. One line, is different in some of them. The fifth stanza, the third line, in maybe Beebe and Durand Lester, I know. Christ, your father's elder son, instead of older, only, It's elder son, so there you go. Everything else, I think, is pretty well the same. It's interesting when you find little differences in words in the stanzas of the hymns. You know, you wonder who changed them. At least I do. I wonder what's the older version, what's the original? When did it get changed? Who changed it? Sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. You know, you can get in, what am I thinking of? The Olney hymns by Cooper and Newton. And if you've got the Olney hymns, the volume, then you can see how the originals went. On a lot of those, there is Fountain Filled with Blood, Amazing Grace, Jerusalem, My Happy Home, the Newton and the Cooper, God Moves in the Mysterious Ways. You don't find a lot of change in them, and that's a good thing. Goebel cleaned up some of Lloyd's. I wish somebody would clean up some of Goebel's. I was never so disappointed. First time I ever looked through a Goebel and saw what a friend we have in Jesus in there, with all of the needless pain we bear and all that mess. And I thought, well, that's all right. And then I got in the supposedly predestinarian Primitive Baptist Church, and somebody called for it. That was kind of recalled in horror when that came up. $118 in Lloyd's. I don't have a Goebel here, so I can't do that. Today, if you will hear his voice, now is the time to make your choice. Say, will you to Mount Zion go? Say, will you have this Christ to know? Yeah, there's some weird ones in Lloyd. I agree. I'm not one to say everything is hunky-dory. There's a couple of sentiments in Beatty's I disagree with, but only a couple, nothing like that. But there is one where he talks about, where it seems to be. Now, I don't know, you can interpret things different ways. And I've always tried to interpret it to fit the doctrine we believe. where he talks about being chosen out of Adam's fallen race. And I was really surprised Bibi put that in there, but when I read it close, it could be that, you know, it's just talking about God's love to his children, even in consideration of the fall. I'll try to give man the benefit of the doubt on those. So there you go. Well, we're going to look at probably the major point of disagreement between, how can we say this, the Orthodox, old school, predestinarian Baptist, and the two-seed Parkerites. Excuse me. Actually, Parker. Why I'm yawning, so forgive me. You've got these considerations after his questions. And this is where he's going to get into some things that's a little weird, a little different. Shall we say his peculiarities. You come up here, baby, but you got to sit and be good and not bite daddy like you were doing. All right. I now submit the following considerations. What did I tell you? First, on the propriety and necessity of the body of evil or fountain of corruption as an opposite to the perfections of deity. So here's where he's going. And even though he calls it his first point, it's really his title and his thesis. This is what these are going to be about. On the propriety or necessity of the body of evil. And he's not talking about these natural bodies that are evil. He's talking about an embodiment of evil, the fountain of corruption. You know, Jesus said, fountain doesn't bring forth both bitter waters and sweet. Was that Jesus or was that James? I can't remember now. Forgive me. But anyway, you know, it's going to do one or the other. Now he's been talking about the perfections of God and the election, union with Christ, and now he's going to talk about the opposite, about the corruption. Bitter waters. Second, could all or either of the divine perfections of God exist to his glory if there were not an existing opposite? Now, here's where he's getting into some things that again, in my opinion, his reasoning here is what's faulty. His very premise in this is what's wrong. If there were, could all of the divine perfections of God exist to his glory if there were not an existing opposite? He's saying that God's glory wouldn't exist, as it were, unless there was something opposite to them that you could compare them to. Now, I don't believe that is necessitous to revelation. Now, that may be necessitous to the natural mind, but to the revelation of the perfections of God by God to his people, there's nothing necessary to compare him to show the opposite, or that he is the opposite of something. Are you with me? Does not the very title, third, Does not the very title or expression of the divine properties of God imply that there is their opposite? Well, of course, there's their opposite. If God is holy, well, let's back up. There is their opposite. Does it imply of necessity there must be an opposite? God is holy. God is intrinsically perfect, perfectly holy, and perfectly righteous in and of himself, without consideration of anything else. Do you believe that? I believe that. I don't believe we have to consider the vileness of the sinner. I don't believe we have to consider the lies, murders of Satan in order to say God is perfectly holy and righteous, and his judgment and his justice is perfect and right. It does not necessarily imply that there is an opposite. In fact, I'll go so far as to say, if it were not God's will that there be an opposite, there wouldn't have to be one. Now, yeah, that's kind of hard doctrine, but I believe it. I believe God has purposed that there be a waster to destroy, just as he is the life-giving one, the life-giving spirit, the one who heals, the one who makes alive. There is also the destroyer. There is Apollyon, Abaddon. There is the deceiver. And if God didn't intend for them to be there, they wouldn't be there. They do not necessarily have to be there because God is holy. That's what I can't, and I can't see how he's getting this, other than, as I said before, if we look at this strictly with our natural eyes and strictly looking for a natural reason, it's probably due to his being able to perceive, to see spiritually more than he can express naturally. So he's come up with this as a way to reconcile this in his mind. 4, if there be a necessity for the opposite to God, is it not equally consistent as God permits the existence of his opposite and suffered his creation to be captured and corrupted by him? See, again, as I said in the very first thing when we talked about Parker, all you have to do is read him to know he had no education. This sentence, which is written as let's just try to read the whole sentence. Or is a question here. Let me read again. If there be a necessity for the opposite to God. So here's what he's got. He's saying, if what I've said before is true, and there is a necessity for this, the opposite principle, whatever God is in his holiness and righteousness, there's an opposite principle there too that exists of necessity in itself. In order for the display of the existence and glory of God, and that's why he's again got this little parenthetical phrase there, in order for the display of the existence and glory of God. In other words, it's there, not but this opposite principle is there so that God's glory shines forth brighter. And the fact of his existence is made more manifest. Look, God doesn't need another principle in order to manifest his existence. And God certainly doesn't need another principle, and particularly an opposite principle, to show that he is all glory. Right? As God permits the existence of his opposite. Now, he's getting into some things now that we could interpret it if we were given to and say, well, maybe he's not saying that the devil, the opposite principle to God, we haven't determined whether it's Satan or something else yet. This opposite principle to God, it's existing at the pleasure of God. That's what he's saying. As God permits the existence. So it's existing at God's pleasure. Well, maybe it's not self-existent. We'll see. And suffered his creation to be captured and corrupted by him. For him to suffer the seed of his opposite, the non-elect, to be sowed. And by a display of his own sovereign power and truth and justice, bring them into just existence, by way of the creation which he had made and his enemy had corrupted. So he's going back to the parable of the tares. He that sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. Tares sprung up, an enemy has done this, has sowed them. So he says, the non-elect are those tares. Therefore, the opposite principle to God is who must have sowed it. That would be the enemy. And God, by a display of his own sovereign power and truth and justice, brings them into existence by way of the creation that he'd made and that the enemy, his enemy, had corrupted. Saying that Satan, or this principle, we're assuming right now it's Satan and the devil, but this eternal principle of evil and wrongdoing and unrighteousness, this has corrupted the original creation that God had made. Now we know that God cursed the ground for man's sake, didn't he? Because of man's sin, God cursed the ground. Not the enemy. God's enemy didn't curse it. God's enemy didn't say, man, I'm going to sow thistles and thorns and everything here on this earth. God said, let's just read it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee. Thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. Now, who did that? That's not Satan talking. That's not the enemy. It's God talking. that by the introduction of them, the sovereignty of God should be displayed, and the body of sin and corruption appear accountable to the sovereignty of God. Okay, now, hey, I can go with that, can't you? And I appreciate his use of the word accountable. Modern man would say responsible, and I have yet to find any man with the ability to respond. But anyway, the body of sin and corruption appear accountable to the sovereignty of God, and that Satan himself, in his very nature, should be manifested, a violator of the divine law or perfections of God. And thereby the right and justice of God in Christ as judge of the quick and dead appear, judging and executing judgment upon the devil and his works, quote, casting the devil, death, and hell into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beasts and the false prophet are, where they shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. Parker speaking in incomplete sentences here. But we can agree with half of this point so far. No, there is not a necessity for the opposite to God. But yes, if there was, as God has suffered his creation to be captured and corrupted by him, that Satan has captured, in a sense, and corrupted man. I don't mean sex male. I mean mankind. I think y'all know that. Because the woman was deceived. Satan, knowing what he knew, went after the weaker vessel. So the sovereignty of God is certainly displayed. The body of sin and corruption is certainly accountable to the sovereignty of God. And Satan himself is going to be manifested as the very lawless one. Excuse me. Cast into the lake of fire. The words all things, spoken of in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, where God, entered by Christ, is crowned with the glory of being the creator of all things. Let's read that, Colossians 1. That's one of my favorite books of the Bible, it's Colossians. There was a time when I read it just because I thought I ought to. But then the Lord opened some things up in it to me. It became a favorite. All right, he's talking about Jesus, his dear son. Verse 16. By him were all things created. Listen, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. What do you think? What part of creation is not included there? What part of creation? My goodness. Let's try that again. Because if we're talking about him creating, then whatever he created was his creation, wasn't it? And we have to look and think about what is being true here. by the Apostle Paul here in Colossians. Look at it again. For by him were all things created. Now, I'll admit, I haven't looked at this phrase in the Greek New Testament in a long time, but I think it is the same phrase as in Romans 8, where all things work together for good. I believe it is. Not 100% sure, but I think so. But Paul's not going to give us to doubt. He says whether they be things in heaven or things in earth. If it's a thing and it's in heaven, Jesus, God created it by Jesus. If it's a thing in earth, he created it by Jesus. Now, get back there, baby. I said, get back. He's going to get even plainer. Visible and invisible. You can see this here stupid cat, can't you? See what I mean? Get off here. That's visible. What you can't see is the individual atoms that make up her, and make up the molecules that make her up her. What you can see is these physical things around you. They're visible. What you can't see is not only the things that make up the visible. Let's go even further. What about the spiritual things that you can't see all the time? What about the heavenly messengers? Seraphs, cherubs. What about them? Well, look here. This is what's interesting. Whether there be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. Do you see what he's talking about? He's talking about those invisible things of creation. I'm going to recommend a book that I haven't finished reading. It's quite modern. He's certainly not a Baptist. It's called The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. And it's very interesting work, and even if you don't agree with it, you'll find a lot to think about. He is, I think his doctorate is in Semitic language. He's a Hebrew scholar, and he deals with a lot of things from the Old Testament on these principalities and powers and thrones and dominions. And when we think about it, remember in Daniel, what chapter is it where Daniel? Yeah, here it is. Chapter 10 of the book of Daniel, where he lifted up. Yes, I'll be glad to do that, brother. He lifted up his eyes, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with fine gold of Uphaz. His body also was like the beryl, and his face as the appearance of lightning. His eyes as lamps of fire, and his arms and his feet like in color to polished brass. And the voice of his words were like the voice of a multitude. And what does he say to him? And he said unto me, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak unto thee, and stand upright, for unto thee am I now sent. Notice there's a whole bunch of people there if you read this whole chapter, but that message was only to Daniel. Think about that. And then he said unto me, verse 12, Fear not, Daniel, from the first day that thou didst set thy heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. Now listen, Daniel has already said he was in mourning for 3 full weeks, 21 days. But he says from the first day you began, that's when it was heard. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. Is that the thrones and dominions? Is that the principalities and powers that Paul's talking about? Those things in the spiritual realm that we don't see with our natural eyes? I believe it is. It's part of them all things. Because he reiterates it here. All things were created by him and for him. So is there a throne? Is there a power? Is there, there's spiritual heads of nations, obviously, based on this. Because I guarantee you one thing, I don't know who the king of Persia was at that time, whether it was Cyrus or Darius or who, but Cyrus or Darius did not, or whatever king it was, did not withstand that angel, that messenger from God. I guarantee. So, there's Colossians 16, fifth. The words, all things spoken of in Colossians 1:16, where God, entered by Christ, is crowned with the glory of being the creator of all things, and the words, all things, spoken in the 20th verse of the same chapter. What's that? And that having made peace through the blood of his Christ, by him to reconcile all things unto himself. By him, I say, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven. By which reconciled to himself by the blood of his cross means the same all things. And we say that these words, all things, include the devil and his works. Will we not make God the author of sin? No, we won't. God's not a sinner because he created the devil. God's not a sinner because he created sinners. So no, he is not the author of sin. Will we not make God the author of sin and establish the universalian doctrine, or deny the power of God? For the same all things, by the peace made through the blood of the cross, he has or will reconcile to himself, as well as contradict that part of the divine truth which declares that the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. He makes that argument from all things, and all things being reconciled, and all things being created. Now, still doesn't mean anything to me. He has not proved his point. He has not set forth an argument showing that this principle of evil that is against God is as eternal as God, and more importantly, is self-existent. Now, I may be a heretic for saying this, but if he had just said that the principle of evil in Satan or the devil or whatever is eternal as God is, because God created it in eternity, we wouldn't have this discussion right now, would we? At least I don't think we would. But no, you've got to make this not equal to God, because nowhere have I found him saying that Satan the devil, the principle of evil, whatever you want to call it, is equal to God. I've not seen that in his writings. I don't see how he could not hold it if he's eternal and self existent. But he goes out of his way in places to say, oh, no. Satan is not, cannot create. He can't do this. He can't do that. He's under the power of God, etc., etc. I was really surprised to find the author of sin language in this volume. Not that I didn't think he would deny it. And here's why. It was accepted. That language was accepted by all predestinarians at that time, as far as I know. And the reason for that, I believe, is because they didn't want to give the Arminians who came up with it an argument. In other words, they didn't want to argue with Arminians about that. So they just gave it to him. Yeah, of course he's not. Of course he's not the author of sin. What are you talking about? Of course not. Nobody believes that. Yeah, there's a few old absolutists out there that do. They're dying every day. They'll all be in the ground before you know it. That kind of thing. So that's what we're kind of getting at. That's what he's kind of getting at here, in my opinion, by saying that God's not the author of sin. Now, personally, I'll not answer that except as an Arminian argument, because it's my opinion that anyone who wants to dwell on that subject is getting their notion from the Arminians. Therefore, let them go back to the Arminians to get their arguments on it. You know, seriously. Just look at them and say, well, my God's the author of all things, period. And just leave it at that. That's how I try to deal with them. Now deal with it. My God's the author of all things, period. And then they'll give you that notion we mentioned yesterday, one of the brethren did. Oh, but sin's not a thing. All right. Before I hit point 6, I need to get some coffee. I'm going to ask you to bear with me 1 second. I did not get the carafe out again, and I apologize for it. But I need to lubricate my throat. I'll be right back, Lord willing. All right, back. As if you couldn't figure that out. Mercy. Lord, it's snowing again. It was almost 40 degrees a few minutes ago. Now it's snowing. Well, that's our hearts. Where was I? 0.6. All right. If I should be wrong in my views on the two seeds, then the serpent did not introduce the principle or spirit of works when he beguiled the woman, and to expose, manifest, and condemn said principle and spirit with its product and author, God was pleased to hand down his divine law by Moses. And thus the law is sometimes called Moses. Stop that. Don't you chase my cats. You know better, boy. Thus the law is sometimes called Moses. Then on that basis could the devil have produced such a strong color of claim to the body of Moses, that notwithstanding the base wickedness which had been practiced, yet Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, durst not bring against him a railing accusation, but said, the Lord rebuke thee. That doesn't make any sense at all to me. It didn't make any sense to me the first time. I don't think it's nothing. That's the truth. Goodness. That didn't make any sense to me. I'm going to read it one more time, and then we're going to go on to 0.7 because it made no sense at all to me when I read it, ever. If I should be wrong in my views on the two seeds, then the serpent did not introduce the principle or spirit of works when he beguiled the woman, and to expose, manifest, and condemn said principle and spirit with its product and author. See, that sentence just doesn't make sense. So, I do want to look at one thing that he says here because it's quite interesting. He says that the serpent introduced the spirit of works when he beguiled Eve, and that what he's doing is exposing this spirit with its product and its author. He said God was pleased to hand down his divine law by Moses, and thus the law is sometimes called Moses. Now, I think what he's trying to say is that, Scripture tells us by the law is the knowledge of sin. If he's saying that the serpent didn't introduce the works principle into man, and in thinking about that now, and this is just right off the top of my head, something just kind of come to me now. When Satan beguiled Eve and she ate of the tree, it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, isn't it? Well, she didn't know anything about the work system. We talked about that. Adam was innocent. Eve was innocent. They didn't have any kind of works. They didn't know anything about sin. They didn't know anything about anything, did they? They were just there. So he's saying that if God introduced the principle of sin into man by the law, which is sometimes called Moses, then the devil had a right to the body of Moses. A little convoluted, but I think that's what he's trying to say. Let's go on to 7, because that, to me, that's a non-argument. If the fallen angels with their product be the beginning of and comprehend all the body and power of corruption, then how can it be possible that